It was a cold, rainy night, and the city lay silent under a blanket of darkness. Rain lashed against the windows of an ambulance as it sped through the empty streets, sirens wailing, tires hissing against the wet pavement. Inside, the paramedics were focused, their destination urgent. But then, without warning, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. A dog. The driver slammed the brakes, tires screeching as the vehicle skidded slightly before coming to a halt. There it stood, drenched, fur clinging to its thin frame, its entire body trembling. The dog didn't move. It didn't bark at first. It simply stood there, soaked and shivering, blocking their path. The rain poured harder, beating down on its fragile form. The paramedics were confused, annoyed even. They honked several times, but the dog didn't flinch. One of them leaned out the window and shouted, hoping to scare it off, but it held its ground, staring straight at them with wide, glistening eyes that seemed to be pleading, begging for something. Its chest rose and fell rapidly, as though it had run a long way. Then it barked. Once. Twice. A loud, urgent cry that echoed strangely through the empty street. It wasn't aggressive, it was desperate. The paramedics exchanged uncertain glances. Something about the way the dog acted felt intentional. It wasn't lost. It wasn't scared. It was trying to tell them something. There was a weight behind those eyes, a message in those cries, something that pulled at their instincts. The dog took a few cautious steps back, never turning away from them, as if testing to see if they would follow. It stopped, looked back, barked again, more insistent this time. The rain continued to pour, but the dog refused to leave. It was clear now that this wasn't just an accident. This dog had thrown itself in front of an emergency vehicle not to cause harm or confusion, but to lead them somewhere. Somewhere important. Somewhere urgent. Something about the moment gripped them in silence. The air, though cold, felt thick with tension. The sound of the rain, the blinking lights of the ambulance, the stillness of the city, all of it paused in that single moment of decision. What did this dog want? Why was it here, on this road, in this storm, stopping them? And, more importantly, what waited at the end of the path it was so desperately trying to show? One of the paramedics, unsure but curious, cautiously opened the door and stepped out into the rain. The downpour soaked through his uniform within seconds, and he raised a hand to shield his eyes as he approached the motionless dog. He waved his arms, clapped, and shouted, trying to scare it off the road. But the dog didn't flinch. It stood its ground, water dripping from its fur, its chest heaving with shallow, fast breaths. Then, without warning, it turned its head, took a few slow steps forward, and stopped. It turned to look back at him, its eyes meeting his with a silent urgency. It was as if it was waiting, beckoning him. Another paramedic joined the two exchanging glances, unsure of what to make of the strange encounter. The dog limped slightly as it began to move again, stepping off the road and into a narrow path between two buildings. It paused every few meters, turning its head each time to make sure they were still behind. Its tail was down, not in fear, but with purpose. It wasn't running away, it was leading them. Something in the way it moved, the way it stopped and looked back, it was unmistakable. It wasn't random. It was a plea for help. The paramedics, though trained to follow strict procedures, hesitated only for a moment. There was something about the dog's behavior that tugged at their instincts. They knew they weren't supposed to leave the ambulance unattended. They knew that this could be nothing more than an animal acting strange. But deep down, they felt it. Something was wrong. The urgency in the dog's movements, the desperation in its eyes, the choice to block an ambulance instead of running from it, none of it felt accidental. So, silently and without words, they followed. The dog led them through puddles and alleys, its limp becoming more obvious with each step. Yet it pushed forward, as though the pain in its leg didn't matter. It stopped again near a dumpster, looked back, and barked softly, almost like a whisper in the storm. One of the paramedics whispered, more to himself than to his partner, It wants us to see something. The dog took a sharp turn down another alley, narrower this time, cluttered with broken crates and debris. The rain seemed louder here, echoing against the metal walls and garbage bins. Still, the dog kept going, driven by something stronger than fear. The paramedics, soaked and uncertain, followed silently, their boots splashing through waterlogged pavement, hearts pounding not from fear, but from the rising tension of the unknown. Every step deeper into that alley made the night feel heavier, the silence more deafening. The only sound was the soft patter of paws, the rustling of rain, and the quiet shuffle of determined footsteps. Something waited at the end of that path, something that had pushed a wounded dog into the road to stop an ambulance to ask for help, not for itself, but for something else. The alley grew darker and narrower with each step, the rain cascading down the metal rooftops and dripping from broken gutters. Trash bins lined the path, some overturned, their contents scattered and soaked. The dog pressed forward, limping more heavily now, its body visibly trembling not just from the cold, but from urgency. The paramedics followed closely, their flashlights cutting through the shadows as their boots splashed through shallow puddles. At the end of the alley, behind a rusted fence and piles of broken wooden crates, the dog came to a halt. It stood beside a small, flattened cardboard box pressed against the base of an old, abandoned building. The box looked like trash, drenched, sagging, and half-collapsed. But the dog didn't treat it that way. Instead, she crouched beside it gently, lowered her head, and nudged the box with her nose. The paramedics moved closer, their lights illuminating the space. That's when they saw it. Inside the box, almost hidden beneath a damp cloth and a piece of torn cardboard, was a tiny puppy. It was barely moving, its breaths shallow, its tiny chest struggling with each rise and fall. Its fur was soaked through, clinging to its frail body, and its eyes were closed, almost lifeless. The mother dog licked its head carefully, whimpering softly. One of the paramedics knelt down, placing his hand above the puppy's body, feeling the faintest warmth. It was still alive, but only just. The mother looked up at them, her eyes glistening, filled with a heartbreaking mixture of fear, exhaustion, and desperate hope. She had brought them here. She had blocked their path, risked her own safety, led them through the storm, not for food, not for shelter, but to save her baby. Everything she had done was for this moment. Her entire body trembled from the cold, yet she didn't focus on herself. She stood protectively over the puppy, refusing to let it be alone even in its weakest state. One paramedic quickly pulled off his jacket, wrapping the tiny creature in its warmth, while the other radioed for assistance. They worked quickly, instinctively, their training taking over, but their hearts were somewhere else, moved in a way they hadn't expected. This wasn't just another call. This wasn't just another rescue. This was something deeper. A mother, unable to speak or beg in words, had found a way to reach out, to scream for help with nothing but her eyes, her actions, and her love. The storm continued to fall around them, the alley still dark and cold. But in that small forgotten corner of the city, something extraordinary had happened. The paramedics kneeling beside the box knew they had arrived just in time, not because of fate or luck, but because a mother dog refused to give up. She had stopped an ambulance, endured pain and fear, and led them straight to where she was needed most, all to save her dying baby. The paramedics wrapped the fragile puppy in a warm blanket, gently lifting it from the soaked cardboard box as the mother dog stayed close, watching with anxious eyes. Without wasting a second, they rushed both to the nearest animal hospital, their ambulance now carrying more than just medical supplies. It carried hope. Inside the warm, bright clinic, the puppy received immediate care while the mother waited, her eyes never leaving the table. Against the odds, the puppy survived. Days later, as their story spread, a kind family came forward to adopt them both. That night, they weren't just saved, they were found.